Lots of things surround the church. And then the other thing I know about this whole thing is that when you approach Manfred, what do you see? You look into Manfred and you see the church. You can see the church, it just sort of framed, the rest of the town frames the church. So the church is the center of Manfred.
So there we go.
Baptized, confirmed, and married here.
In this church.
So was I.
I'm going to get a happy funeral here. You're not as loud as you usually are. I got all the, you know, the things that I think.
That's okay, I can still hear it wonderfully.
I think I know why. I need to pedal faster. This church was sitting over this way further, closer to the parsonage.
Oh.
Well, that's the parsonage next door.
Yeah, it is. And so there was a small lumberyard or hardware store sitting right here. And the ladies thought maybe we can make use of that. It's, you know, modest, moderate size and use it for their functions. They bought it in 1914, and in 1918 they realized this is not working for like their suppers and different things. So they, I guess in their talking together, they said, we need a parlor underneath the church, a church basement. So they went to the men and said, we would like to have a church basement or parlor. And the men said, that won't be possible. We're way too busy. And that was, of course, summer, and everybody's a farmer, or a lot of them were farmers.
Right.
And this is what happened. 2 weeks later, there was a special meeting called for the building of the church basement. So who went home and did their homework?
Yes. You know, there's, what's the saying? A couple ways to skin a cat, or whatever it is. I mean, if you think about it. So, and the parlor got built?
Yes, and they used horses to pull the dirt out.
Wow.
Yep, and they had a ramp, you know, so on the ends so that they could keep getting that dirt out. And after they got it all done, this is where the big story comes. They had jacked up the church, and I think they used things like telephone poles or whatever as rollers, and they had it ready on the rollers, ready, but it was the end of the day. So they went home with the idea that they would do it the next day, roll it onto this new foundation.
Right.
Well, during the night, there was a big storm.
No.
Yeah,
oh, no.
There was. And when they came in the morning, this is what they found. The church was rolled partway onto its foundation.
God started putting it on the foundation himself.
They had help.
Yeah, they had help. They had divine help.
Yep.
The job was half done when they came back.
Yep. So it was pretty awesome. So that's one of the special stories of this place. But the other story that happened when Adolf was 12 yet, everything in 1918, was that they called another meeting, and I think that was probably early in the year, because there were people moving to town who were not Norwegian.
Mm-mm.
And they would like to have a place to go to church. And they were probably German Lutherans, you know. And so, you know, the traditional people, I mean, the settlers themselves, were very shy about speaking English. They might understand some, but they were reluctant to give up their language. And this was true in German and all different ones, from what I've learned. And here, they called a special meeting. And two brothers were on the two sides of the controversy. Ole Melby, the ancestor, my great-grandfather, not great-grandfather, great-great-uncle, because he'd be my grandfather's brother.
Yeah.
So great-great-uncle, I think you call it. And he was on the traditional side, which was a lot of people here, because this is 1918.
Right.
A lot of them, you know, a lot of the settlers, they lived into the 40s, 1940s. So they saw this big change, and that's what I want to speak to over in that Ostrom house that I took you into.
Yep.
I want to share the changes the settlers experienced from, you know, just horse and buggy, no communication except walking to the neighbors, to 1908 came the party line, and electricity, if they could have a Delco plant, then they could have electricity sooner. But that didn't come until later, like the 40s for electricity itself. But went right through these little towns, they got it earlier. But out in the country, you didn't tell about the 40s. I think it got here in the 20s for these two lights going. And then you had the other side, like his younger brother, Chris, who had not yet then, but eventually had 13 children. And of course, he was a legislator in Minnesota for 2 terms, so you had to speak English. And these children come home and are teaching you more English. And whereas Ole, he lost his only child as an infant, so they had no children. So he was of the old school. Well, they were sitting right up there, and each one spoke. Ole got up and said, you know, this church was built by Norwegians, for Norwegians, in the Norwegian language, and I believe it should stay that way. And of course, there'd be a lot of people that would really do their heart good. And so then he sat down when he got done with his, and then Chris got up, his brother, and he said, well, I have nothing against what is Norwegian or the Norwegian language, but we must remember, and Adolf, you know, I kind of use this, because I have his words verbatim, because he says, I'm remembering it as if it were yesterday. So then he spoke it to me in a tape recorder. And we've transcribed that onto paper. And he said, I have nothing, but we must remember, we are in America, and we must do what is in America. And they did vote to start having English services. But the pastor, who was here for 30 years altogether, 35 years, Adolf said he had a hard time. So I have a feeling what he did was to probably write his sermon out in Norwegian, and then somebody who was savvy in English could translate it for him. So that first year they had 1 service, and then each year then they would add, like have 2, and then 3, and 4. And by World War II, there were no more Norwegian services.
Wow.
No more services in Norwegian.
Oh.
Because wars do something to everything.
Uh-huh.
And then that's sort of too when they were starting to you know, not sit just men and women.
Yeah.
And this is the same story in the other, like, nationalities that had churches. It's kind of similar story.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of some two special stories for this place.
Yeah.
And the ladies mainly were the ones who paid for projects. And they would have suppers.
Suppers and
people like to eat, so they would give money.
And there's still some of the little churches like Rose Valley.
Yeah, you know, when I grew up, Rose Valley Lutheran Church, my mother's maiden name is Yordall. So, you know,
got some Scandinavian.
Scandinavian. But anyway, when you were talking about the ladies' aid back there, I told Linda, that's how I got to be such a big guy. It's because of the ladies' aid.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Well, they'd make stacks of lefse and butter and put it out during ladies' aid.
Yeah.
It was like I had died and gone to heaven, you know.
I know.
I mean, I still love lefse, but it's so hard to make, you know. But I'm talking like stacks of it all on these tables.
And then the meatballs and the mashed potatoes.
All of it. Oh, man, ladies' aid. Oofta.
I know, and everybody was invited to ladies' aid.
Yeah.
It was a community thing.
Yeah.
It really was.
So, you know, maybe you didn't attend the actual ladies' aid part, but when they first started.
We will begin by singing our opening hymn is 543. Praise to the Lord the Almighty. In this country, over the last 13 years, we have experienced this very same thing with 13 years ago. All our illusions that we lived in the safest, most secure, and peaceful country in the world were shattered when we watched the airplane crashes, one after another, into buildings who we thought were safe. The result was fear, bone-chilling, life-altering fear. And the fear we felt resulted in shutting down, a closing off, a hardening of the rules. We put up the walls and reinforced the fences. All the people that got isolated was absolutely terrible. Because you know what that produced? A lot of depression in people, because it was like over the winter time, and that's a lot of depression. It was dark, cloudy out. They didn't get to see other people. You couldn't go in the nursing home and visit anybody. It was terrible, you guys. That was one of the worst things I ever had to do, because I couldn't go see all the people that were in the nursing home. I hated that. There were rules for eating, for washing, for working, for praying, rules for going to the bathroom and for going to the temple, rules for buying and preparing food, and rules for bathing. Pretty much any daily routine had rules by which it was structured. From the time you were a little child, you would learn these rules because your daily life was built within this structure. And once you learned them, they became second nature to you. Just another part of the way you lived your life. And all was well until this strange rabbi showed up Jesus on the scene and started breaking the rules. Some were big ones, like pulling up a cushion to share a meal with a tax collector, touching women who were unclean, or healing the sick on a Sabbath, a day when you were supposed to be resting. Some were small, like the ones recounted. broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body. Do this in remembrance of me." Again, after supper, he took the cup, and he gave thanks, and he gave it for all to drink, saying, "This cup is a new covenant in my blood, shed for you and for all people for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me."
And that doesn't, it's easy. Yeah. Twice a year, I would come up here from New Mexico, and I'd either stay with my mother and I'd come up here. I'd stay with my mother in Mandan, but then I'd also come up here, and that's where I got going in rotation of. I think I had about 6 or 7 places where I would stay, and but I kind of ended up at Rose. But then eventually Rose said, "You know, you should stay up at Herbert's because he would. I think it would be a blessing for him." So I stayed with him then towards the end before we moved. Before Richard retired and we moved to Mandan, and then I'd stay with Herbert or Rose. And so that last time in '98, before that was the tipping point, I was staying at Rose's, and I sat both Pete and Rose down, and I said, "You know, this is just getting overwhelming for me. I'm so pulled here," and of course we're living in New Mexico, and that's what Rose said, "Come." Yeah. That was the big word. That was the, and that it doesn't take. You know, like we are saying that it doesn't take, a concept can be in one word.
Yeah.
Or just a few words.
Yeah.
Like nothing is impossible.
Right.
That's 3 words.
Yeah.
So.
But yet so profound.
Yeah, very profound. So that brought me up here.
Yeah.
That brought me up here.
And I love that one word, come.
Yeah, come. It's. The church is the center of Manfred.